Is that supposed to impress us? The laughter came sharp and easy, bouncing off the polished floors of the community center like it belonged there, like it had every right to fill the space. A few folding chairs scraped lightly as people shifted to get a better look, drawn in not by curiosity, but by the promise of entertainment at someone else's expense. Emma Carter stood in the middle of it, her hands clenched just enough to keep them from shaking, her voice still hanging in the air from the sentence she hadn't meant to sound so important. My granddad was a Navy SEAL. It had come out simple, honest, but in the wrong room, honesty sounded like a joke. Officer Jake Reynolds leaned back against a table lined with pamphlets and recruitment flyers, arms crossed, a grin spreading slow across his face like he'd just been handed something too easy. A SEAL? Huh, he said, tilting his head slightly, the tone already halfway between amusement and disbelief. Which team was that? Team Make-Believe. A few of the younger guys near him chuckled, the kind of quiet, knowing laughter that didn't need to be loud to sting. Emma swallowed, her eyes flicking instinctively toward the far side of the room, where her grandfather sat alone in a metal chair that looked too cold for a man his age. Robert Carter didn't move. He sat with his hands resting loosely on his knees, shoulders slightly curved from years no one here could see, his gaze not on the people laughing, but somewhere beyond them, as if the noise simply didn't reach him. He wore a faded brown jacket that had seen more winters than anyone in the room could count, the fabric soft at the edges, the color worn down by time and sun. Nothing about him suggested legend. Nothing about him demanded attention. And that, more than anything, made the laughter grow. Come on, Reynolds continued, pushing off the table now, stepping a little closer, his boots making a soft, deliberate sound against the floor. If he was a SEAL, you'd know something, right? Rank, unit, anything real. The questions weren't questions. They were a test she was never meant to pass. Emma felt the heat rise in her face, not from shame, but from the sudden weight of every eye in the room pressing down on her. She knew what her grandfather had told her, or rather, what he hadn't told her. Stories that stopped halfway, answers that came in quiet smiles instead of details. He doesn't talk about it, she said, her voice softer now, but steady. Reynolds let out a short laugh, shaking his head as if that confirmed everything he needed. Yeah, they usually don't, he said, especially when there's nothing to talk about. Another ripple of laughter followed, louder this time, more confident. Someone in the back muttered something about internet heroes, and the phrase drifted just far enough to land where it hurt. Emma's fingers tightened at her sides, her eyes returning once more to her grandfather. For a moment, she thought he might stand, might say something, might end this with a single sentence that would silence all of them. But Robert Carter didn't move. Not yet. His eyes shifted slightly, just enough to take in the room, the exits, the spacing between people, the rhythm of voices rising and falling. It was a small movement, almost nothing, but there was a stillness in it that didn't belong to a man being laughed at. It belonged to someone who had heard worse, seen more, and learned long ago that noise meant very little. Across the room, near the entrance, a woman in a crisp uniform paused mid-step, her attention drawn not by the laughter, but by that stillness. Captain Lisa Monroe didn't know why she stopped. Not yet. Only that something about the old man in the worn jacket didn't fit the story unfolding in front of her. And somewhere deep beneath the noise, beneath the jokes and the easy confidence of people who thought they understood what they were seeing, something quiet had already begun to shift. The laughter lingered longer than it should have, stretching thin across the room until it became something sharper, something that pressed against the edges of silence without quite breaking it, and Emma felt it settle into her chest like a weight she could not shift, her eyes still fixed on her grandfather, as if willing him to move, to say anything that would make the moment stop bending against her. But Robert Carter remained exactly where he was, his posture unchanged, his breathing steady, his presence quiet in a way that did not ask for attention and yet somehow refused to disappear, and that was what Captain Lisa Monroe noticed first. Not the girl, not the officer with the easy grin, but the absence of reaction in a man who by all appearances should have been uncomfortable, out of place, maybe even embarrassed, yet he was none of those things. And Monroe's gaze narrowed slightly as she took a step further into the room, the faint hum of the overhead lights filling the space between the fading laughter and the next wave of words that Reynolds was already preparing, his confidence, growing with every second that passed without interruption. So what? He just sits over there and lets you tell stories for him, he said, gesturing loosely in Robert's direction without bothering to look directly at him, as if the man himself was less important than the punchline he represented, and a few more people shifted closer now, drawn in by the tension, their conversations dropping to low murmurs that circled the scene like distant wind. Emma felt her throat tighten, but she held her ground, her voice quieter now, but still carrying enough to be heard. He does not need to prove anything, she said, and that earned another short laugh, sharper this time, less amused and more dismissive. Everyone needs proof, Reynolds replied, his tone flattening just enough to show the edge beneath it. That is how this works. And as he spoke, his eyes finally moved past Emma, landing for the first time on the old man in the chair, really looking now, scanning him from worn jacket to steady hands to the way his feet were planted just slightly apart, balanced, grounded, and for a fraction of a second, something flickered across Reynolds's expression, something uncertain, but it vanished as quickly as it came, replaced again by the practiced ease of someone used to being right. Across the room, Monroe slowed her steps, her attention sharpening, because she had seen that flicker too, and she had seen the stance, the way the man occupied space without claiming it, the way his gaze moved not randomly but with quiet intention, and it pulled at something in her memory, something she could not yet name, and she shifted her angle slightly, watching more closely now, the details beginning to arrange themselves in ways that did not match the story being told out loud. Reynolds took another step forward, closing the distance just enough to make the moment feel tighter, more focused. Sir, he called out, his voice carrying across the room with a forced politeness that did not quite hide the challenge beneath it. You want to back her up here? And for the first time since the laughter began, Robert Carter lifted his head just a little more, his eyes meeting Reynolds's without urgency, without tension, just a calm, steady acknowledgement that seemed to absorb the question rather than answer it. And when he spoke, his voice was low, even, carrying no trace of defensiveness. She said what she believes, he said, nothing more, nothing less. And the simplicity of it hung in the air longer than anyone expected. Monroe felt something shift more distinctly now, a quiet alignment of instinct and observation that told her this was not a misunderstanding, not a harmless exaggeration. Something was off, something important, and without drawing attention, she reached for her phone, turning slightly away from the center of the room as her thumb moved across the screen with practiced precision, her expression unchanged, her posture relaxed, but her focus absolute, because somewhere behind her composed exterior, a single thought had taken hold and refused to let go. Find out who he is. And in the center of the room, Emma stood still, caught between doubt and something deeper she could not yet name, while the man everyone had dismissed sat quietly, as if time itself was waiting on him to decide when this moment would end. Reynolds let out a slow breath through his nose, the kind that carried more impatience than amusement now, as if the moment had lingered longer than he had planned, and he was no longer fully in control of it. His eyes still locked on Robert Carter, searching for something that would restore the balance he was used to, something dismissible, something ordinary, and not finding it made him shift his weight slightly. A small adjustment that most people in the room would not notice, but Monroe did. And so did the quiet part of the room that had begun to grow beneath the surface noise. That is it? Reynolds said, his voice tightening just enough to reveal the edge underneath. That is all you have got? He added, and there was a subtle challenge in it now, not just directed at the old man, but at the situation itself, as if he needed it to resolve in a way that made sense to him. Emma felt the tension change, felt it move from laughter into something less comfortable, something uncertain, and her eyes flicked again to her grandfather, hoping for more, for anything that would push back against the growing pressure. But Robert remained still, his hands resting exactly where they had been, his fingers relaxed, his breathing steady. And when he spoke again, it was not louder, not sharper, just as measured as before. Not everything needs to be explained, he said, and the words settled into the room like weight rather than sound, causing a few people to glance at each other without quite knowing why. Monroe's phone was already to her ear now, her body angled slightly away from the center, her voice low and controlled. I need a quick check, she said, keeping her tone neutral, professional. Name is Robert Carter, older male. Civilian clothing, possibly prior service, I want. Confirmation on any special operations history. There was a brief pause on the other end, just long enough for the background noise of the room to creep back in. Reynolds stepped closer again, now within a few feet of Robert, his presence more direct, more deliberate. Look, sir, he said, forcing a polite edge into his voice. This is a military event. We take things like that seriously. So if there is something real here, now would be the time to say it. The words were framed as reasonable, but the intent behind them was clear, a demand disguised as courtesy. Emma felt the pressure of it and stepped slightly forward without realizing, as if placing herself between them even though no one had asked her to, her voice barely above a whisper. He does not have to prove anything to you. And that was when Monroe heard the shift on the line, a change in breathing, a pause that was not empty but loaded, followed by a voice that came back sharper, more alert. Repeat the name. The man on the other end said, and Monroe did, slower this time, Robert Carter. There was a longer silence now, the kind that did not belong to confusion but to recognition. Monroe's grip on the phone tightened just slightly as she waited, her eyes never leaving the old man across the room, and then the response came, lower, controlled, stand by. No explanation, no dismissal, just those two words, and Monroe felt it immediately, the confirmation that whatever she had sensed was real. She lowered the phone slightly, but did not end the call, her attention returning fully to the scene in front of her. Reynolds exhaled again, this time more openly frustrated. Right, he said, glancing briefly at the small crowd that had gathered, as if seeking reinforcement. That is what I thought. But even as he said it, the confidence in his voice did not fully return, because something had changed in the room, something subtle but undeniable. The laughter was gone now, replaced by a quiet that stretched wider than before, and at the center of it, Robert Carter sat as he had from the beginning, unmoved, unbothered, his gaze steady, as if he had seen this moment play out long before anyone else realized it had begun. The silence stretched just long enough to become noticeable, not empty, but filled with something heavier, something that pressed against the edges of every conversation that had tried to continue and failed, and Reynolds felt it even if he refused to acknowledge it, his jaw tightening slightly as he shifted his stance again, trying to reclaim ground that was no longer his. All right, he said, louder now, forcing the moment forward. Let us keep this simple, his voice carried across the room, drawing attention back to him as if volume alone could restore control. If he really was what you say, then there would be something. Anything official, something we could verify right here. His words hung in the air like a challenge issued to the entire room, and a few people nodded subtly, clinging to the structure he offered because it felt familiar, predictable, safe. Emma felt that pressure again, the pull toward doubt, the quiet question creeping in where certainty had been, and she glanced back at her grandfather, searching for reassurance, for something solid to hold on to. But Robert Carter remained exactly as he had been, his stillness now standing in contrast to the growing tension around him. And for the first time, Reynolds stepped even closer, closing the gap until he stood just a few feet away, his presence now direct, unavoidable. Sir, he said, the words sounding more like a test than respect. I am asking you plainly. And as he spoke, his eyes dropped briefly, catching a small detail he had missed before, something pinned near the inside seam of Robert's worn jacket, not polished, not displayed. Just there, almost hidden, a small piece of metal dulled by time. Reynolds reached out without thinking, his fingers brushing against the edge of the fabric as he pulled it slightly aside to get a better look. What is this? He asked, the question sharper now. Curiosity mixing with skepticism. The object itself looked insignificant, a coin, maybe, worn smooth along the edges, the surface marked by faint engravings that had lost their clarity over the years. You carry this around like it means something? He added, a hint of mockery returning to his voice as he turned it slightly between his fingers. And in that moment, something changed, not in the room, but in Robert. It was not a movement anyone could clearly define, not a shift in posture or expression, but a subtle tightening, a quiet line drawn, that had not been there before. His hand lifted slowly, not aggressive, not hurried, just deliberate, and he gently took the coin back, his fingers closing around it with a familiarity that spoke of years rather than seconds. "It means enough," he said, his voice still calm, but carrying a weight that made Reynolds hesitate for just a fraction of a second, and that hesitation did not go unnoticed. Monroe, still holding the phone at her side, heard the voice on the other end return, this time without pause, without uncertainty. "Where exactly are you?" the man asked, and Monroe responded quietly, giving the location in precise terms, her eyes never leaving Robert. "Do not let him leave," came the reply, firmer now, followed by a brief silence before the line stayed open. Monroe felt her pulse steady rather than rise, the clarity of the instructions settling something in her mind. Confirming what instinct had already told her, she slipped the phone back slightly, her posture unchanged, her presence still blending into the background for anyone not looking closely. But her attention was locked now, fully engaged, back in the center of the room. Reynolds exhaled slowly, as if trying to shake off the moment. "A coin," he said, forcing a small laugh that did not quite land. "That is your proof." But the room did not respond the way it had before. No laughter followed, no easy agreement, just a quiet that had deepened, become more deliberate. And Emma saw it too, felt it shift, the weight of doubt beginning to lift, replaced by something steadier, something she could not yet name. And through it all, Robert Carter remained seated, the coin now resting in his hand, his gaze steady, as if the entire moment was simply unfolding at the pace he had already accepted. The coin rested in Robert Carter's palm, its worn edges catching just enough of the overhead light to reveal faint lines etched into its surface, lines that meant nothing to most eyes in the room, but carried a quiet gravity that seemed to bend the air around it. And as his fingers closed over it again, something deeper shifted behind his gaze, not visible, not dramatic, but present, like a memory stepping forward without asking permission. The hum of the room faded in his ears, the distant murmur of voices replaced by something older, something carried not in sound but in sensation, the weight of air thick with heat, the steady rhythm of controlled breathing, the quiet discipline of movement measured in inches rather than steps. And though none of it showed on his face, the past moved through him with a clarity that did not need to be spoken. Reynolds noticed none of it, or if he did not understand it. His attention still fixed on the object he had just dismissed. "You expect people to believe that?" he said, his tone less confident now, as if the words were being pushed out more from habit than certainty. Emma stood still, her eyes locked on her grandfather, and for the first time since the moment began, she saw something different, not in what he did, but in what he carried, a quiet depth she had always sensed but never fully understood, and it steadied her in a way no explanation ever could. Across the room, Monroe shifted her weight slightly, her focus narrowing further as she watched the interaction unfold, every detail now aligning with the response she had received, the instructions still echoing clearly in her mind. "Do not let him leave." And she understood now that it was not about control, not about authority, but about recognition, about ensuring that something important was not overlooked in a room that had been too quick to judge. Reynolds exhaled again, a sharper sound this time, frustration edging into his posture as he took a half step back, trying to regain the distance that would allow him to reset the moment. "All right," he said, louder again, addressing the room as much as the man in front of him. "If that is all we are working with, then I think we can safely say this has gone far enough." He gestured loosely, as if closing a discussion he believed he had already won, but the room did not move with him. No one laughed, no one nodded. The silence held, and it held because something unseen had already begun to shift the balance. Monroe's phone vibrated softly in her hand. Not a call this time, but a message. She glanced down just briefly, her eyes scanning the screen, and for a fraction of a second, her composed expression tightened, not with surprise, but with confirmation, the kind that settles rather than shocks. She looked back up immediately, her gaze returning to Robert Carter with a new clarity, a new weight, as if the man sitting in that simple metal chair had just been placed in an entirely different context, one that the rest of the room had not yet caught up to. Emma saw the change in Monroe's eyes even if she did not understand it, and it anchored her further, the doubt now receding, replaced by a quiet certainty that did not need validation. And at the center of it all, Robert remained exactly as he had been, his hand resting loosely again, the coin hidden once more, his presence unchanged, as if the past he carried and the moment unfolding around him were simply two sides of the same quiet truth waiting for the room to catch up. The shift in the room did not announce itself with sound, but it moved through people the way a change in weather moves through the air, subtle at first, then undeniable, and Monroe felt it settle into place as she lifted her gaze from the phone, the message still clear in her mind, a line of confirmation that did not need elaboration because it carried the weight of everything it did not say. She stepped forward now, not abruptly, not forcefully, just enough to enter the space that had been held by tension and uncertainty, her voice calm, measured. "Officer Reynolds," she said, and the tone alone was enough to make him turn, not because it was loud, but because it carried authority without needing to raise itself. Reynolds straightened slightly, reflex more than thought, his earlier confidence shifting into something more cautious. "Captain," he replied, the word coming quicker than expected. Monroe nodded once, her eyes steady. "I think we should take a moment before we close anything," she said, and there was no accusation in her voice, no challenge, just a quiet directive that did not invite argument. Reynolds glanced briefly toward the small crowd as if looking for support, but none came. The room had already begun to lean away from him without fully realizing it. "With respect, Captain," he said, attempting to regain ground. "There is nothing here to—" Monroe did not raise her voice, but she did not step back either. "There is," she said, and that was enough to stop him. Not the words themselves, but the certainty behind them, the kind that did not come from assumption but from knowledge. Emma watched the exchange, her breath held without realizing it, her eyes moving between Monroe and her grandfather, sensing that something had crossed an invisible line, that the moment was no longer balanced on doubt. Reynolds shifted again, his posture tightening. "What exactly are we waiting for?" he asked, and this time there was a trace of tension he could not fully hide. Monroe did not answer immediately, her gaze moving briefly to Robert Carter, then back to Reynolds. "Clarity," she said, and as the words settled, the faint sound of a door opening somewhere behind them slipped into the room, quiet enough that it did not interrupt conversation, but distinct enough that Monroe's attention flicked toward it instantly, her posture straightening almost imperceptibly, her focus sharpening. Emma followed the movement, turning slightly, her heart beginning to beat. Faster for reasons she could not explain. Reynolds did not turn right away, still caught in the need to maintain control of the situation in front of him. "Captain, if this is about," he started, but his words slowed, then stopped entirely, because something in Monroe's expression had changed, not dramatically, not visibly to everyone, but enough. Enough to signal that whatever was coming next was no longer part of the conversation he thought he was having. The room felt it too, the quiet deepening, the space between people widening just slightly as attention began to pull toward the entrance without anyone being told to look. And at the center of it all, Robert Carter remained seated, his gaze steady, his presence unchanged, as if the moment unfolding was simply arriving exactly when it was supposed to, not rushed, not delayed, just inevitable. Emma's fingers curled slightly at her sides, her uncertainty now replaced by something steadier, something stronger, and across from her, Reynolds finally turned, just a fraction at first, his instinct catching up with the shift he could no longer ignore, and in that turning, the balance of the room tipped fully, the last traces of mockery dissolving into a silence that no longer belonged to doubt, but to anticipation. The door did not slam. It did not announce itself with urgency or noise. It simply opened, and yet the effect was immediate, a subtle shift in the air that moved through the room faster than sound, drawing every eye without a word being spoken, the kind of presence that did not need permission to be noticed, and the first man who stepped through carried it with him like it was second nature, his posture straight, his movement precise, followed by another, and then another, each one dressed in the same quiet authority that did not display itself but could not be mistaken, their boots making soft, measured contact with the floor as they entered, not in formation, not in a show of force, but with a coordination that spoke of years spent moving together without needing to speak. Monroe's shoulders squared slightly, not out of tension, but recognition, her earlier certainty now fully realized. and she took a half step back, not retreating, but making space. Reynolds felt it before he fully saw it, the shift behind him, the sudden absence of control he could not explain, and when he turned fully this time, his expression changed, not dramatically, not in a way he would admit, but enough for the room to feel it, his confidence faltering just slightly as his eyes moved across the men who had entered, taking in details he did not consciously process but instinctively understood. The room had gone completely still now. Conversations cut cleanly, even the faint background noise seemed to fall away, leaving only the quiet rhythm of footsteps approaching. Emma felt her breath catch, her eyes widening as she watched, not fully understanding what she was seeing, but knowing with absolute clarity that everything had just changed. The men did not look at the crowd, did not acknowledge the room. Their focus moved past all of it, settling on a single point, and that point was Robert Carter. The distance between them closed slowly, deliberately, each step measured, until they stopped a few feet in front of him, and for a brief moment, no one moved, no one spoke. The silence stretched, heavy and complete, and then the man at the front, his gaze steady, his posture unyielding, did something that shifted the entire weight of the room in an instant. He straightened fully, his hand rising with precision, and he saluted, not casually, not symbolically, but with the kind of respect that was absolute, unmistakable, and without hesitation. The others followed, one after another, the motion synchronized without command. The gesture held in silence, and the effect was immediate. The room froze, not metaphorically, not in exaggeration, but in reality. Every person present caught in the stillness of a moment they could not have anticipated. Reynolds stood motionless, his earlier words hanging in the air with nowhere to go, his posture rigid now for entirely different reasons. The certainty he had carried replaced by something he could not define. Emma felt something rise in her chest, not shock, not confusion, but a quiet understanding settling into place. And through it all, Robert Carter finally moved, not quickly, not dramatically, but with a calm that matched everything about him. He looked up at the men in front of him, his expression unchanged, his eyes steady, and for a second, just a second, there was something unspoken that passed between them, something that did not need explanation, did not need words, and then, with the same quiet precision, he lifted his hand and returned the salute, not as a performance, not as a reveal, but as something natural, something that had always been there, waiting only for the moment to be recognized. The salute did not end the moment. It deepened it, stretching the silence into something almost tangible, something that settled over every person in the room with a weight that could not be ignored. And for a few long seconds, no one moved. No one spoke. The world narrowing to the quiet exchange between the men standing and the one seated before them. And when Robert Carter lowered his hand, the motion was slow, deliberate, as if it carried with it years that did not need to be explained. The man in front of him followed, his arm returning to his side with the same precision, and then, without raising his voice, without shifting his tone, he spoke. "Sir," he said, the word clear, steady, carrying a respect that did not ask for recognition because it was already complete. "We have been looking for you." The sentence landed softly, but its meaning rippled outward, touching every corner of the room. Monroe exhaled quietly, not in relief, but in confirmation, the final piece settling into place exactly where it belonged. Reynolds stood frozen, his earlier confidence now fully replaced by something else, something heavier, his mind moving quickly, trying to reconcile what he had just seen with what he had believed only minutes before. But the gap between those two things was too wide, too sudden, and for the first time since the moment began, he had no words. Emma felt her chest tighten, not with fear, but with something deeper, something that felt like pride rising slowly, steady and undeniable. Her eyes fixed on her grandfather, as if seeing him clearly for the first time, not just as the quiet man who sat at the kitchen table, but as someone who carried a history that reached far beyond anything she had imagined. The man who had spoken took a small step back, not to create distance, but to acknowledge space, his posture unchanged, his gaze never leaving Robert, and behind him, the others remained still, their presence calm, controlled, waiting, not for instruction, but for recognition. Robert looked at them, his expression unchanged, but there was a subtle shift now, something softer beneath the surface, not pride, not relief, just a quiet acceptance. "I was not hard to find," he said, his voice as steady as before, and there was no accusation in it, no question, just a simple statement that seemed to carry more meaning than the words themselves. The man nodded once, understanding without needing explanation. "Some names are not meant to be searched," he replied, and the room absorbed that sentence in silence. Monroe's eyes moved briefly to Reynolds, watching the realization settle in, watching the way his posture had changed, the tension now coming from within rather than being projected outward. Emma took a small step closer to her grandfather, not out of uncertainty, but out of connection, her hand hovering for a moment before resting lightly against his arm, and Robert did not move away, did not react, but the gesture remained, simple, grounding, real, around them. The room remained still, no one daring to interrupt, no one willing to break the quiet that had replaced the earlier laughter, and in that silence, the shift was complete. The story everyone thought they understood had rewritten itself without explanation, without announcement, leaving only one truth standing in its place. And for the first time since the moment began, no one questioned it. No one spoke for several seconds after the words settled, as if the room itself understood that anything said too quickly would break something that had only just been restored. And in that silence, the weight of everything that had happened pressed gently but firmly into every person present, reshaping expressions, straightening postures, quieting thoughts that only minutes ago had been loud and certain. Reynolds stood where he was, his hands no longer relaxed at his sides, but held still, his gaze fixed on Robert Carter with a focus that was no longer questioning but searching inward, replaying each word he had spoken, each assumption he had made, and finding no place for them to stand now. Monroe watched him for a moment, not with judgment, not with satisfaction, but with the calm understanding of someone who had seen moments like this before, moments where perspective shifts do not come with noise, but with silence. And she said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. Emma remained beside her grandfather, her hand still resting lightly against his arm, her earlier uncertainty replaced by something steady, something rooted, her eyes moving between the man who had entered and the man she had always known, now seeing the quiet connection that linked them, not through explanation but through recognition. The man who had spoken earlier took a small step back again, creating just enough space to allow the moment to settle, his voice low when he spoke once more. "We will not take more of your time," he said, and there was no formality in it, no distance, just respect. Simple and complete. Robert inclined his head slightly, a small acknowledgement that carried more meaning than a longer reply ever could. "You already have," he said, not as a complaint, not as a correction, but as a quiet truth, and the man understood, a faint nod answering in return. The others shifted subtly, their presence easing, not diminishing, but settling into the background once more. The purpose of their arrival fulfilled without needing further action, Monroe exhaled softly and stepped back fully now, her role complete, her earlier instinct confirmed and resolved without disruption. The room remained still, no one rushing to fill the silence, because there was nothing left to prove, nothing left to question. Reynolds finally moved, just a small step, his voice when it came quieter than before, stripped of certainty, stripped of defense. "Sir," he said, the word no longer a test but an acknowledgement, and he paused, searching for more, for something that could match the weight of the moment, but finding nothing that would not fall short. And in that pause, he lowered his gaze briefly, a gesture small but genuine. Emma watched him, not with resentment, not with triumph, but with understanding, because the moment had changed more than just the room. It had changed him too. Robert Carter stood then, slowly, without strain, without urgency, the simple act drawing every eye once more, not because it was dramatic, but because it was enough. He placed a gentle hand over Emma's for a second, a quiet reassurance, then looked around the room, not at any one person, but at all of them, his gaze steady, calm, carrying the same quiet presence he had held from the beginning. And then he turned, taking a few measured steps toward the exit, not waiting, not lingering, simply moving forward as if the moment behind him had already been placed where it belonged. Emma followed beside him, her steps matching his without hesitation, and as they passed through the doorway, the room remained still, watching, not out of curiosity, but out of respect, the kind that arrives without being asked, without being demanded, and lingers long after the moment has passed, leaving behind a silence that speaks more clearly than any words ever could. Because some truths do not need to be explained, they only need to be recognized.